Hello, I'm Jeff Braun.
And I'm Ross Bentley. And
there are
no dumb questions. Yeah, we suck at that.
We're terrible at that.
Yeah.
One day.
Well, hopefully we won't totally suck at answering a couple of questions here.
Looking forward to it. The reason we keep doing more of these podcasts is so we can get our timing down right. It's not because we really want to answer these questions. It's just practice getting our timing right on that.
The day that the day that we nail that together and totally in sync,
yep,
we're out.
It's over. It's
that mic drop thing, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So what do we got this week, or this month, or this session, whatever we want to call this?
Okay, so we have one from I'm not sure the actual name, but it was phu.boo. I'm not even going to go there, but that's how it's spelled. So I think it's a great question because it's about doing crazy things, which you and I have often done, even when we're not trying to sometimes. But
yeah.
So the question was, what was the craziest idea that you've had that no one thought would work, but ended up working really well? And I was like,
great.
I haven't had that many ideas that worked well, so I'm going to have to think about that.
And this has nothing to do with driving rental cars, right?
I think it could. It's not too specific. It's, yeah.
Because I seem to recall...
You've had rental car things that have turned out well?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define well, because I recall maybe teaching your underaged sons how to do reverse 180 spins at some point.
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
And you know, one of your sons ended up in Hollywood, so
right.
Almost a stunt driver in a way, right?
Exactly. That was he still talks about that, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
That was okay. That was a crazy idea, and it turned out not bad, let's say.
So I don't know about crazy ideas that somebody else thought would not work but worked, but a couple of things immediately come to mind of things that I thought were kind of crazy that I thought I'd just try, and they did work. And the first one was, I was actually, I do some driver training for a car manufacturer's R&D department. And we're at this track and I'm teaching these engineers to drive or to drive better. And we, for a variety of reasons, at one point, you know, we're towards the end of the last day. And I thought, I'm just going to have everybody drive this entire track that they would normally drive in using second, third, and fourth gear. I'm going to have them drive the entire track in fourth gear. And immediately myself and the fellow that runs all their driver training programs and everything, we kind of looked at each other and kind of went, wow, this is going to be like, you know, they're going to be like 8 seconds slower. And we were both shocked at with very little, with, you know, maybe, I don't know, 10 laps, 12 laps maximum, they're down within a second of their best lap times, only using fourth gear. Wow. And I guess the real magic though happens like, so they all would go out there on the track, and the idea was drive it in fourth gear and really think about where can you kind of roll momentum through the corners and really flow the speed through, and not like over slow the car, but also work on where can you get back to throttle just that fraction of a second earlier, because you're having to get back there because the engine's a little boggy, or very bogged down. Mm-hmm. And all of these drivers worked away at that. And like I said, came within, I don't know, a second and a half of their best lap times. And then afterwards it would be, okay, now go back and use your regular gearing. And they all went about a half a second to a second a lap faster than they'd ever gone before. And it just kind of proved that many times we overslow corners. And I think, you know, some of it is that, you know, the old, you know, in slow out fast kind of training that we've had, that drivers will come in, they'll overslow for a corner, and just not use all the grip the tires have, and not take advantage of the speed they can roll through the corner, and not take advantage of the momentum from that. So that's what happened, was doing that. And since that time, I've used that with drivers of every level, including drivers in IMSA LMP2 cars during a practice session, like run in a taller gear than you normally do. And, not just drive through there and go, well, this sucks, but drive through there and try to figure out how to make that work. And sometimes drivers come away from that going, well, I'm going to go back to all the other regular gearing that I used, but not in turn 6, because I found that I'm actually faster using that taller gear in that corner. And so it was a big surprise, and it's now part of my regular coaching routine now.
Wow. I mean, that's awesome, because if a driver can do that, then he can actually help me as the engineer when I blow the setup and it's loose, like middle out of a corner. He gets on the gas and it's loose coming off and it's sideways, and he's like, I don't like that, but it's in the middle of the race. Tell me what you think, but I often find that if they can run up a gear, the torque isn't as much. And so it's like a traction control, but not really. And they can keep the momentum going and get on the gas at the same time, but it doesn't free up the rear tires and give them that little looseness. And if they're used to if they're experienced because of your training there, to running a gear up, they can actually change the balance of the car by using that taller gear.
And the other thing is it protects the rear tires, because once the rear tires start to go off and you're in that, let's say, a second gear corner, and you're kind of trying to come out of there smooth and you're trying to be all nice to the rear tires, use third gear, and it just doesn't abuse the tires as much. And you may be able to extend, especially in endurance racing, like we do a lot of, is where, there's nothing much you can do other than just make the most of it. And in endurance racing, we've talked about this before, is so much of it is how do the teams that win are the teams that adapt and deal with the problems the most. And if your problem is the rear tires have gone off, well, and if you can make those rear tires, you can lose 0.3 of a second, where that other team over there is losing 0.6 of a second per lap, you're going to win.
You're going to win. Exactly. Yeah, no, that's a good one. That's a good one. So I don't think it's that crazy of an idea, but I get it. At the time, people are like, want me to do what?
Yeah. And, I've had drivers that kind of feel a little frustrated by it when I say do this, but I don't think I've had a driver yet that didn't come back from that and go, that was worthwhile doing.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's a good one.
So another one that sort of comes to mind that was, another one of these things where you're just at the track and you're trying to figure out different ways to deal with things. And so I was coaching 2 drivers that were racing in the Formula Mazda series a number of years ago. I can't count that many years ago anymore. And we were actually at Portland International Raceway, 2 drivers I'm working with in the same team. And after a practice session, they had turned lap times that were within a couple hundredths of a second of each other, almost identical. And yet when I sat down and went through the data and the video with them both, one driver, I'm kind of watching his hands going through the corners, and his hands are, they're moving, but they're neat, tidy. The other driver, it's like watching a dirt track, a sprint car on a dirt track, like the amount of steering, like there's just like all over the place, just catching it. The hands are moving 1,000,000 miles an hour. And a thought came into my head of like, how many degrees of angle, of steering angle, has that driver put in? And I went to the engineer and said, can you write a math channel that basically adds up the total number of steering angle degrees that each driver put in over the course of one lap? So, and it wasn't like, a degree of right cancels out a degree of left, but it would, that would add up to 2,
Right.
So it was the total steering angle. And she wrote this math channel. And I remember it was something like the one driver that had, I'll call it tidy hands. That driver had something like 750 degrees of steering angle for a lap. Mm-hmm. The other driver had something like 875 degrees. Like it was a massive difference.
Right.
So I went to that driver and said, your goal for the next session, the next practice session, is to dampen your steering movements. Do everything else run at the same speed, but I just want you to turn the steering wheel less, to move it a little bit less. And your goal is, let's get it under 800. And I can't remember exactly, but it was, he came back and it had gone from 875 to 805 or something like that. Right. But he went 0.4 of a second quicker than the other driver.
Wow.
Which didn't make the other driver very happy.
No.
But it just kind of showed that, first of all, there's two different ways to go fast. One driver with tidy hands, another driver without tidy hands. But and I'm not saying that the hand should never be moving, but in this case, the driver's hands were moving too much, almost in an artificial way. Like, obviously they didn't need to move that much. And I actually think that, and I talked to the other driver who had like 750 degrees of angle. It was almost like, well, you need to push the car more to the point where you need more steering input. Like the car needs to move a little bit more. And, there was probably some magic point in there where the fastest lap time was going to come with 815 degrees of steering angle. One needed to actually push the car a little harder. One needed to kind of calm things down a little bit and bring it together there. But it was one of those things that, and I've used that. I've had other engineers write that math channel for me because it's way beyond my abilities in a data system. But it's really interesting. And, it shows there are different ways to accomplish the same thing. I remember James Weaver racing in sports cars, and James Weaver was the king of the late breakers, and James, unbelievably fast driver. And one year at Road Atlanta, we were both driving the Riley and Scotts. He had the Ford engine, I had a Chevy engine, and we had turned lap times in practice sessions that were, again, within less than 1/10 of a second of each other. And because we were friends from rival teams, we decided that we were going to share some of our data just for the fun of it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we shared was the throttle histogram.
Yeah.
And it showed that, I think, like at Road Atlanta, something like, and again, I can't remember the exact numbers, but like my foot was flat to the floor at 100% throttle, something like 68% of the lap. And James's foot was there 77% of the lap, or 78%, like 10% more of the lap at full throttle. And you kind of go, well, how did we turn the same lap time, essentially?
Right.
But the difference was he was at 78%, 100% throttle, and like 12% of the lap at zero throttle.
Right. I
was at zero throttle, like 5% of the lap. So I tended to be a little more smoother feeding in, whereas he was like an on-off switch on the throttle. So different driving styles, but we ended up being sort of in the same place. And it's the same kind of thing with that steering angle thing, I think. So. Yep.
Well, I think that's really cool. And that actually, I have one along those lines. It's very similar to, I was using at one point average throttle as a number. So you have how much you spent at 100% for a lap. I was using the average throttle position. So if you took the throttle position however fast your data system logged, every 100th of a second or 10th of a second, and you then averaged it out, you get a number. So you spent that whole lap at an average of 58% throttle. And I had a driver that I thought was just not aggressive enough. It was just kind of a mild-mannered, kind of easy on the throttle. And I thought he just needed to just grab the car and just go and be more aggressive. And I thought, not a driver coach, but I can look at that number, that average throttle. And I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. You're not going to look at any throttle, brake, steering traces. You're going to get a number. And we had telemetry on the car, so I could get that at the end of every lap. you're going to get a number from me as you cross start finish, your percent throttle average for that lap. And your goal is to make it more the next lap. So, and I know from a real coaching standpoint, just stabbing the throttle and trying to get that number up probably isn't the right thing. But I had a different goal.
But it's the awareness a lot of like, it's the awareness. Then all of a sudden the driver starts thinking, oh, I wasn't quite at full throttle there. And I could be.
Right. Or I could maybe get to the throttle a tick earlier and get that number higher.
Yeah.
And maybe I could leave the throttle on just another car length before I put the brake on and get that number higher.
Yep.
And we started to do that. And again, it wasn't technically correct for his style, but he got it up 5-6%, and his lap times went faster. And he realized that he could leave the throttle on a little longer. He could get to it a little sooner, and it didn't spin out, and it wasn't scary. And he became a little more aggressive with the throttle. And so that was kind of the thing, the thing that you wouldn't think would work was just worry about average throttle for a lap. And that's all we did. And it actually did work. We applied it like you did with your steering to a specific learning case. It's not always the guy with the less steering is faster or the guy with the highest average throttle is faster. But in particular instances, it turned out that both of those were pretty helpful.
And sometimes it's just relative. Like for me, seeing with the full throttle thing, comparing my 68 to James's 78, it just made me think the next time I'm on track, could I make it 69 as opposed to 68?
Right.
So, I was never going to get to there because James and I drove in with different styles.
Yeah.
But, and I don't know whether James started to think about, well, could I feed in, get just a little bit of throttle, but it as a driver, it makes you think that way. So
yeah, I guarantee, knowing James, I guarantee he did, because I've seen you with other pros overlaying data, and, one guy's a little faster. You run the same lap time, but, I've heard, it doesn't matter. You with another pro, and it's like, wow, how are you so fast in that corner? And the other guy's like, no. How you beat me by 3 miles an hour in this corner. How do you do that? Because you both know that if you glom on to that, to what the other guy's doing, maybe you can apply that to you and you go faster.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, neither of those things are terribly crazy, but they're things that you wouldn't normally think of, or maybe you do think of when you're at the track, and all that matters is how do we perform better? Right.
Yeah. So I have one that's a mechanical, technical engineering one, and I won't get too in depth with it, but it was back in the old days. This is going to be 94-ish, 94 probably. And we had this car. It was a Ferrari 333, iconic open cockpit Ferrari sports prototype. People who are 40 years old or older will probably remember it. Anyway, and it made some pretty good downforce, and it was before the days of third springs. And a third spring is nothing more. It's really a fifth and a sixth spring. So you have your 4 springs on a car. At the front axle, you have another spring that only works when the whole car is being pushed down. When it rolls, it decouples and doesn't work at all. So it just increases the vertical stiffness of the car. And you can put one of these third springs in a car that's designed with it in the rear to do the same thing. In the old days, what we had to do is we had to run packers and bump rubbers on the main springs. So when the car got pushed down by the aero, it didn't hit the ground, and it stopped it. So the Ferrari was designed without a third spring. And I decided that I could come up with a way to connect the 2 shock absorbers on the front axle to another shock absorber that kind of made it a hydraulic third spring. And people are like, oh, that'll never work. It's you got to design the car with a mechanical third spring, like Indy cars and Formula One cars were running at the time. And I built this, I fabricated this thing up in my shop on my little lathe and stuff. And we went to go run it. And after some teething problems, it turned out like worked really good. Let me lower the whole car almost 10 millimeters, which on a flat bottom car was pure downforce. And it worked really good. And nobody really thought that would work until, and we tried to keep it secret for the last 3 races of the year. And then I go to the PRI show and I'm talking to Jeff Ryan, who was the head of Penske Shocks, the most brilliant shock absorber designer I've ever known, taught me a lot. And he says to me, he shows me, hands me a device, and I'm looking at it, and it looks like kind of like a third spring. And he goes, a hydraulic third spring, and he said, hydraulic third spring. What do you think? And I was kind of quiet. I'm like, well, I don't know, maybe it'll work. I didn't want to say too much because I had built mine 4 months ago, and we were trying to keep it secret. And he's like, well, before you say anything, and he reaches in his briefcase and he pulls out a stack of like 6 pictures, and it's pictures of my third spring on my car. And I said, okay, let's go talk. And we went in the back room and we talked, and I said, I got to have this. This is 100 times better than what I built, way better thought out, much better design. And he goes, yeah, nobody thinks it'll work. And I said, I guess me and you do. And he goes, I think we're the only ones. Long story short is he gave me the unit. I helped develop it for him. It was much better designed, and he had much better ideas than me. And we developed it, and it turned out to be, you couldn't run a Ferrari 333 in a day without it and be competitive. And it ended up on Indy cars. It ended up on Riley and Scott prototypes. It ended up on Australian touring cars, and then eventually got banned by most series. And then now most cars, LMP2, LMP3, DPI in today, all have mechanical third springs that do the same thing. But so it was the idea that not many people thought would work that now is common.
So, Jeff, can I ask you about another idea that you told me about one time? I'll see if you're willing to share this story.
Okay.
You talked about putting a torque sensor on the steering shaft of an Indy car at the Speedway.
Yeah,
because that's just really interesting to me. That
was now most, well, maybe not most, but any car with a electric power steering, like a KYB electric steering, like LMP2s and DPIs, have that built into the motor to measure the torque. But this was Indy 95, 96. It's when Dallara first got into IndyCar racing in the IRL. And their engineers were super interested in the feel of the driver, what the driver was feeling. Because their simulations kept on showing that the car should go around the Indy 500 track faster than what the drivers were driving it. And they were smart people. They were like, they were doing Formula One and top level sports cars. And this just didn't register with them. And they became interested in what was going on. And so they wanted to understand what the driver was feeling, not necessarily what he was doing. That was a result of what he was feeling. What is he feeling? Why is he reacting the way he's reacting? So we put a strain gauge basically on the steering shaft that measured torque, the twist, the force in the steering shaft. And we had a steering sensor that measured angle, like is pretty common. And we started looking at it at Indy. And if you take like turn 1, and we saw the steering angle going up. In other words, he's turning more to the left. And the steering torque, the actual force in the steering shaft going down, we knew it was understeer, right? Because the tires were slipping. There was nothing to grip and make torque against. and the angle was going up. So he was turning more, asking for more, please more, and he's not getting it because the tires are sliding a little bit. And so that would tell us understeer immediately. And it was actually, we could see it in much finer detail than the driver would report it to us, because we could see the torque go down. The opposite was worse. You'd see torque go up, like the fronts are really gripping, and steering angle going down, like he's turning back to the right to catch an oversteer. And we knew that was oversteer. Or usually knew that was oversteer at Indy when you had to go visit him in the infield care center. But we called that too neutral. Yeah. Too neutral was too free, but you didn't crash. And you could see it in this with this steering torque sensor. And it became a great way to quantify the amount of understeer and oversteer at Indy and be safe. And then Dallara became, because of that one little sensor, they became super attuned to figuring out that you were going to go faster at Indy or most ovals if you could increase the driver's concept of where the limit was. The limit was much higher than where his concept was, where his perceived limit was. And if you could increase his perceived limit by making the car feel better, by making the steering better, by changing the setups so that he perceived closer to the limit, he would go faster, even though the car was no faster. It couldn't go around the corner any faster, but the driver could perceive it, that he could go around it faster. And that whole steering torque sensor was the one thing that helped us really delve into that. And at the time, nobody thought it was, important at all. But now everybody runs a steering torque sensor, and it's part of standard practice.
I think it's interesting when the car manufacturer is thinking, it's not, they're designing the car around how to give the driver essentially more feel, more confidence. And it's a reason why you've been so successful. I believe one of the reasons you've been so successful as an engineer is you understand that ultimately there's a human being in there. And if they're not comfortable, if they're not confident, and if they're not, you can make the car faster, but if a driver doesn't feel it, they're not going to drive it faster.
Exactly. I don't care what the simulation says. If the driver's not going to go there, then we're never going there, right? Yeah. If he thinks, hey, you can carry 5 miles an hour faster in that corner, the simulation says you can, and he thinks he's going to die every time he does it, we're never getting there. I got to get the car, and maybe I have to soften it up or do something to make him feel what's going to happen. And then if he goes, okay, I know it's going to understeer, so I know that's going to happen, I can feel that now, I'll try that 5 miles an hour faster because I know I'm not going to spin out and back into the wall. And that's kind of what that whole steering torque sensor gave us an idea of what the driver was feeling. They try to describe it to you, but a lot of times they're like, feeling, I was just trying to save myself. That's all. I don't know what it felt like. Well, this kind of gave us a description of that. And it's no wonder that Dallara, and there's other really good manufacturers obviously out there, but it's no wonder that Dallara is a leading manufacturer, and especially of customer cars, because they really pay attention to what the driver is feeling and allowing him to drive their cars closer to the actual limit of what it can do.
Yeah. More drivable. Yeah. So got a second question here, and it's actually from Tony Coelho, who is one of the smartest guys in motorsport. So I don't know why he's asking us.
Yeah. I mean, I want Tony's answer to this one.
Yeah.
He definitely taught me and Colin more about go-kart racing than any other human on the planet. And so, and he wasn't just good at go-kart racing. He's a really clever guy. If you ever race spec me out against Tony, you've come up against his cleverness. So good question.
Well, so his question is, with unlimited resources, which I have no idea what that looks like, but with unlimited resources and no rules, would tires or aerodynamics yield the fastest lap times?
Yes.
I think the answer is 42.
42. Right.
Yeah.
Whew. I think Tony, he may just be, that may be a question that he's just trying to get us to say some things that he can later bring us and say, but you said.
So admit how stupid we really are.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is that's not a dumb question, but here comes some dumb answers on it. Wow. I would say unlimited resources and no rules. I'm going to say aerodynamics. If I had to pick one, I would say aerodynamics.
And why?
I think the tires are not limited much by, and I have to say tires, let's pick a class. Let's pick LMP1 before this hypercar nonsense and stuff, 2 years ago. Those tires were really not limited by rules. Those were confidential, the best Michelin could come up with tires for that car. They're limited a little bit by size maybe, but I don't think if they were unlimited in size, they would be much bigger, much different in compound, much different in construction. I think the tires at that level are probably pretty much as good as they could make them if the rules were completely wide open. There could, they still have to go a stint or two, things like that. If they changed the rules and made them only have to go one stint, or made fueling and tire changing at the same time legal in WEC, maybe the compounds would get a little softer and things like that. But I think the tires are pretty close already. Aerodynamics, I mean, if you opened up aerodynamics, you would have full ground effects. You would have, think about the old fan cars, the Chaparral cars and the Brabham BT, whatever that 49, whatever that thing was with the fan in it and stuff. I mean, think about what you could do now with batteries on board and powering fans and full sliding skirts, and with the technology we have now to seal the skirts good, and giant tunnels and fully adaptive wings. And you talk about DRS, well, we'll do this, we'll adjust the wings and the balance interactively in the middle of a corner. We can set the steering so that if it starts to understeer or the center of pressure moves a little bit, the wings will just automatically in milliseconds adjust to keep the balance exactly consistent through the corners. The room to exploit unlimited resources and no rules in aerodynamics, I think, is just far broader than what it would be in tires.
Well, and then you'd end up adding like 10,000 pounds of downforce, and the tires would all blow out. So you'd have to.
Right. So then they'd have to come. Then the tires would have to get harder and probably less grippy, just because you'd have to compensate for all of that. I mean, we saw that, right? GTP racing back in the day. We saw the Nissan GTP cars making so much downforce that the tires just couldn't take it. And we'd blow out and backflip in Road Atlanta.
But help me understand that. I mean, so, let's say you put 10,000 pounds of downforce on a car, and now, the tires have to be able to handle that. It's going to be a lot of the construction stuff to support that, right? But would the compounds change a whole lot? Like, if you're pushing a tire into the track that hard, is it sliding as much as it does now?
So you could make the case for softer compounds could work, because what kind of the paradox a lot of people don't get is they're like, oh, my tire is overheating, I need a harder compound. Well, you do, because the soft compound will blister sooner. But the reason it's overheating is because it's sliding across the track, that friction. If it was totally locked into the track and not sliding, you wouldn't make near as much heat. So you could actually make the case for more downforce allows you to run softer tires, because you're not sliding as much. It's pushing it into the track. It's locked into the track, and it's not sliding across, making friction and heat and overheating your tire.
Yeah. So you can't have one without the other to some extent.
Right.
But you would start with aero.
I would start with aero because there's so much. I mean, can you imagine if you take that to its extent, if you had fully active aerodynamics, that's pretty cool to begin with. But now, and we had that, not fully active aero, kind of we did in the fully active suspension days, because the suspension was active to keep the aero platform where we wanted it.
And if there's no rules, you're going to have the fully active suspension again.
Fully active suspension and fully active aero. Now we're going to adjust our wings and our ride height for our tunnels to be right and our wings to be right. And then the next step that wasn't around in those days is think about AI or machine learning. You put that in the computers, and now the car and its aerodynamics and its suspension, but aerodynamics, let's talk, gets smarter every lap. Yeah. Because it goes around a lap and it goes, okay, well, we did this and this and this, and the center of pressure moved a little bit this way, and we know we don't want that, so we learned that that's better. Or every time the center of pressure did this, the driver did this, and that slowed them down. So the next lap, I'm not going to adjust the wing quite as much, or I'm going to adjust it more. And it's machine learning to adapt to the situations every lap.
Imagine if you could do that and apply that to drivers.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Wait, we do. Yeah. We do. They have their brain. They adapt all the time.
Some of them do.
Some of them, right.
Yeah.
So to me, aero, I think aero, I don't know. What do you think? I know you said 42. I might just go with 42. That might be the right answer.
Well, I think we better go back to Tony and ask Tony, because apparently Tony has unlimited resources.
Right. Well, on his spec Miata that he dominated so much with, if it's a spec Miata with unlimited resources and no aero allowed, then tire 100%. That's where you're gonna. Okay. That's where you're gonna gain. Okay. And anyway, that's a really good question.
It's fun to think about that stuff, isn't it? And I don't know how often you do that as an engineer. Kind of go like, I have to think that, a guy like Adrian Newey, that's how he thinks. It's like, there are no rules, there are no budget. I'm just going to think way out there and then bring it back, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's where designers probably do. I don't get a chance. That's why it's a good question by Tony, because I got to think about it. I don't normally think about that because as a race engineer, I have my car, I have my rules, and I'm trying to work within that and exploit the rules right to the limit as much as I can and try to get what I can. But I'm, I guess a lot of people have heard about that level 5 D Sports racer we built. And it kind of opened up my thinking to that, because there were almost no rules and we had pretty much unlimited resources. And so I actually did get to do that in one small project, probably once in my career.
Yeah.
So it's fun to think about, and it would be really cool to see that happen. I mean, what was it? Porsche not too long ago took their LMP1 car, put active aero on it, and just tried to go break lap records at every place and went faster than Formula One cars and stuff like that. It was kind of like that, in a way, within reason. They didn't get super carried away, but I think it did have active wings and like drag reduction and active, maybe even active suspension. I can't remember, but they did that not too long ago.
And it gets me thinking about if I had unlimited resources and no rules in terms of what I would do with a driver in terms of driver development. That would be an interesting one to go through. And then I immediately go to, well, there was definitely limited resources, but we thought a little outside of the rules, or not outside of the rules, but outside of the box in terms of developing Colin. And Tony was a big part of that too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I guess one of the things that could happen, if you had all that aerodynamic weirdness we just talked about, when does the human driver G-force limit? I mean, we saw it at Texas in the IRL years ago, where you were just like, hey, the drivers are blacking out. Do we have to wear pressure suits now in the car we just talked about, or what? Maybe driver human limits come into play.
Which at that point, if we're taking the driver out of the car, that might be the point where I said, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. No, and I go, I've said this for years and years. The thing I would really like is less aerodynamics, less downforce. I think everything should have a lot less downforce. I'd much rather, this is probably bad to say, but we sit at the IMSA races and we're in the office, we're getting ready for our races and we're having our meetings and whatever. We have the TV running with the current track feed of what's ever happening. The place, our office, and I know other guys, it's the same thing. Our office absolutely stops working when the MX5 Cup race comes on.
Absolutely.
Those are the best races. Yeah. No downforce. The guys are wheeling the bejesus out of it. They're sideways and it's I've said it's like 4-wheel MotoGP.
Yeah.
It's just awesome.
Yeah.
No downforce. We need less downforce in general, I think.
So if we made like the percentage of tire grip to aero to engine power to brake power, and you applied that to a car that has 1,000 horsepower. So it would essentially be 1,000 horsepower MX5 Cup car.
Right.
Now it would have a little more grip and appropriate to the same level. That I'd pay to see.
Right. Think about power. What you just described is a MotoGP bike.
Yeah.
The power they have and the contact patch they have and the downforce they have. What a great combination. Let's do that on 4 wheels.
Yeah.
Like you said, 1,000 horsepower, little tired, no downforce race car. Whew, man, we'd see guys driving them. Now they just go around the corner and you're like, yeah, that's pretty cool. It's hard to tell the difference between, I don't know, pick your guy, between Lewis Hamilton and some pay guy in a Formula One car. You watch them go around the corner, you're like, yeah, it's pretty much the same. You can't really see the talent of Lewis Hamilton. It's all masked by the aerodynamics.
Yeah.
Okay, I got off on a rant of why I don't like.
Okay, well, yeah. Again, when we become the kings of motorsport,
right?
Yeah,
we'll do that. In the meantime, watch MX5 Cup and MotoGP, and you get
there.
You
go.
Yeah.
Yep. And so that wraps up another episode. So, hey, if you have a question for us, send it to me through Speed Secrets, to Jeff through Instagram, me through social media, whatever. Just hey, if you can't figure out how to get a question to us, well, I'm not going to say it.
Right.
That would be a dumb question. How do we get it to you? That would be a dumb question if there was a dumb question. Okay. Right. So yeah, but if you have a question for us, please let us know. We love doing these things. It's all about Jeff and I having fun.
We had a blast. We'll do some more here when we get a chance. We're both off to Sebring here pretty soon, so we'll maybe do some after that.
Yep. In the meantime, keep learning, having fun.
Sounds great. Have fun, everyone. We'll see you next time.